Hi, friends. We're talking Africa and its trade relations with China. We're seeing more and more economic trade deals happening between China and countries on the continent. We're also hearing more and more concern coming from the West. Just recently, the outgoing Foreign State Secretary of the United States talked about how more trade with Africa and China potentially compromised African countries' sovereignty. We're hearing things like neo-colonialism, and we're here to unpack trade between Africa and China and exactly what the implications are. I want to introduce the members of our panel to you today. My name is Christine Mundwa from Zimbabwe, and I have Harrison Mulima from Tanzania, and he says, if I can just find it, that African countries who will benefit from these economic relations with China are those with clear economic foreign policies. Linda Irolo is from Nigeria. She's next to me, and she says there is no such thing as free lunch in China's relation with Africa. And last but not least, Ubong Simon, who is also from Nigeria, says there is nothing new. It's just China's turn. Certainly looking forward to the conversation, but I will open with the question about the approach that the Chinese have taken in their dealings with Africa. What kind of deals are we seeing, and how exactly is this money exchanging hands?
So China, first of all, China combines its aid, investment, and trade when they cooperate with African countries. So when China gives aid, for example, to African countries, then this aid normally is attached to the export, Chinese exports, for example. So we know that China needs raw material, and China, of course, needs market, and of course, the African countries can provide market for China's goods. So for China, this is this is very good for China, but then this also means that African countries, in this sense, when you look at China-African trade, most of the time it's the African countries who are exporting raw materials.
Okay.
That means they lose a lot of work, especially in this process of value addition. Mm-hmm. That means when they send their raw materials and they import a lot of China's goods in the African countries. So this is like the trade relations, which, of course, China was, or at least China tried to view itself or its African relations as an alternative from the Western countries. But from this point of view, then here we see still, like during the colonial times, that African countries are still producing raw materials, being taken by China, and then they are providing the market, for these manufactured goods which are coming from China.
Okay.
And this is the relation we see here, the trade relations, which combines also other elements.
Ubong, I want to bring you in here because you talk about the fact that the way China is dealing with Africa, so to say, is not new, that we've seen this before. The only thing that's different is it's China's turn in Africa now.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said, because, when you look at, the way Europeans and also the US dealt with Africa in the past, there seems to be a kind of, a continuous process, whereby they invest their money, then they get produce out of Africa, So I think the only problem now is that it's just that it is China and not European Union or America. For example, if you take the case of Nigeria, a typical example in the oil industry.
Yes.
We hardly have value added to the Nigerian economy directly from the oil industry. Most of the profit is still going to oil multinationals that are not companies that are local in Nigeria. Shell, Mobil, and Chevron. So I think it's basically just that it is from the Asian continent and not from Europe or America.
And why are we seeing that? In the case of a country like Zimbabwe, for example, our former president Mugabe at some point shifted his policy and we would hear him standing on campaign platforms and talk about looking east. And part of that had to do with the fact that this is a place where he could get money from. And there was one criticism about Chinese investment onto the continent, that the Chinese are ignoring things like human rights abuses and looking purely at the economics, which no one can argue in the case of Africa because of our resources. The economics are there. There is good reason to invest in the continent and to deal with our leaders. I want to bring you in here at this point. A lot has been raised in terms of concern about this trade relations with China. Do you share the sentiment, or do you sympathize at least with the sentiment coming from the West to be cautious?
I do sympathize with the comments from the West, but I'll also say that the comments from the West is the kettle calling the pot black. They're not doing anything different. They're just doing it in a different, they're using a different strategy to do it, and which is why we don't see the disadvantages that China brings with its trade and infrastructure and all that. And there is this debate on the breakdown of the new liberal order, and that is what everyone has been ramming down the throats of leaders, that, the fact that you have a non-democratic country coming into the continent, this country doesn't take account of the fact that they have to ensure that states follow the issues of good governance, transparency, accountability, human rights, and also care for the environment. And this is a problem. But my argument would be that China is. We have to tread carefully, and not just with China, but with every country coming into the continent, because they're not coming in for the good of the continent. They are coming in for self-interest. And with this, I want to, really stand hard in this realist position and say it's just a play of power. Everyone is struggling for power. The West is afraid of the rise of China, because we're talking about rising powers right now, and China is seriously growing, and they're afraid of that. So any way to kick them off the competition, they will.
I disagree with you, with some of the issues you just raised, especially these critics from the West that China is not intervening, especially in this when countries are bad leaders. I mean, when there is a bad leadership, or when there is bad governance, then China is not intervening. But we have seen changes in policies recently that actually, after so many critics from the West, there was a situation where China actually was convincing Zimbabwe, Mugabe, or even Congo actually, to go into negotiations with the opponents. So of course it's not like putting this pressure with its aid, like what the Western countries are doing, but it's in a way convincing the partners to enter into negotiations. So it's listening to these critics, and China is working on it, but in a very different way. So of course China would still deal with the bad leaders, dictators. Of course China will still deal with them, but because of these critics, then we see some changes here.
I've listened to politicians from our continent sort of defend themselves and their dealings with China, and you often hear the argument that the Chinese treat us as equal partners, that we meet, we sit at a table, we don't feel inferior as we would in the context with the West, and we are not dictated to as to what we should do in order to be beneficiaries of these trade agreements. Is that how it should be, and is that justified for the Chinese? Does it justify how they do business? For example, we won't ask questions, we won't force you to uphold certain standards in your countries. We will sit at a table, we'll do the economics, and we'll leave you. Is that good for the people of our continent if China deals with our leaders in that way?
Well, I mean, personally, I would feel that it is the job of African leaders and policymakers to sit down and decide what they really want from international partners. That is, whether it's China, US, or European Union, or maybe part of countries from Southern America. It doesn't matter, because on this particular point, I can still remember during the 1990s, we had a dictator, Sani Abacha. Nigeria suffered from lots of sanctions, but still, the government of Sani Abacha was still able to, was still trading oil to the United States, to every part of other parts of the world, despite these sanctions. So in this case, like what Linda said, it's like, a kettle calling a pot black, so they are doing the same thing. It's just that it is now the time of China.
And I'm getting that from I'm getting that definitely that the approach may actually be the same, and then she put it very well with that metaphor. But what I want to understand is, are Africans not potentially paying a higher price by having a trade partner in China that ignores the glaring issues of human rights abuses and funnels money and keeps some governments who would otherwise potentially have no options? I look at a country like Zimbabwe. Mugabe would have had fewer options. And probably wouldn't have lost it as long as he managed to, without Chinese money flowing into that country. Is this good for the people of the continent, where China comes and turns a blind eye to the abuses of human rights and pours money into these countries?
I think this is like a strategy. This is like a foreign policy strategy of China. I have a colleague who was looking at the rhetorics of China when China goes to West and when China goes to Africa. Yeah, the rhetorics, if you look at the speech of the heads of the government, it's very different. In African countries, when they come, they have these rhetorics that we have been exploited by the Western countries, And if you look at the history, China started cooperating with African countries already after the independence of most of these countries, and China was taking part in this non-alignment movement. And in this non-alignment movement, these principles of non-intervention, these principles of respecting sovereignty were very important. And of course, China's been holding to this policy. Yeah, that means for China, even when they don't care. I mean, if you don't follow, if the African leaders don't follow human rights, then they don't care, which of course I think one can see it critically, because as you mentioned in your example that there is an alternative, and this is what China provides to the African countries, that if the West does not want to provide money, then they have somewhere else to look. They can go east. But this is for China. This is like a strategy they use, that they, if countries are in conflict with the West, then they can go to China. But for China, this is also like a way to pursue other interests.
But is it detrimental to the people of our continent?
I've met with some top people in African institutions and African leaders who say that China presents an attractive alternative, because we go to meetings with the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, and the narrative is always that we sit at a table and they tell us, okay, we will give you this money if you do this, this, and this. And then China comes in with this rhetoric of would provide economic advancement with non-interference, and that's what Africa likes. But I feel like we will be stupid to think that any external power that comes into the continent is coming in for our good.
That's why I say it's a foreign policy strategy.
So at the end of the day, we'll be paying, not even at the end of the day, we're already paying for it. Yeah. Like I was looking at data and it shows that they said in 2000s, the importation of Chinese textiles was about 25%, and in 2004 it rose to 85%, and 75,000 people lost their jobs. You have situations where they buy land and then the contracts go to the Chinese companies, and you have 30% of the people being employed from Africa, and then the rest, 70% from China. So we are losing jobs, we're losing land. At the end of the day, this is really detrimental, and we should really be careful, because this is neocolonialism happening all over again. The difference is that we have our leaders sitting in and participating and allowing these people come in and take over.
That's why I think it's really like a foreign policy strategy. I mean, this good governance and human rights has to come from the African countries themselves.
Yeah.
Because even when Western countries come and say you have to change your governance, the way you have to improve your democracy. If the countries don't want to do this, they can just have like an election. They show you that, they have free and fair election, but what is going on inside, it's really something different. And I think, of course, the conditionalities, the external actors can put conditionalities to force African countries to change, but I think it's more practical when it comes out from the African countries themselves rather than from the Western countries, especially now when there are other alternative actors, like China, who is like, they can still cooperate even when a country does not follow human rights and good governance. So.
You've highlighted some of the issues, the job losses, the industries that have been annihilated because of cheap imports coming through from the Chinese. What are maybe some of the advantages that we can see? Because it has not all been bad. For example, we were looking at visuals. So I was seeing pictures the other day of massive trains being unveiled in Kenya. This was Chinese investment. This is something that the government can say to people, look, this is what's going to change your life. The money came through from the Chinese. What other projects are we seeing that we can really point to as good examples of money that's been put to good use?
China are very famous for infrastructure projects, and I think this is where you really see like the China engagement in Africa. This is like physical. You really see. Most of the critics, for example, to the Western countries, is like you support good governance, you support democracy, but sometimes you cannot physically see this. But for China, infrastructure projects, you can see. They have supported, for example, standard gauge railway in Kenya. They have so many other projects. There's a dam, like a power plant coming in Nigeria. There's so many. They have this policy of one belt, one road, where they put a lot of money for any countries who is interested in like borrowing money from China. But again, I think Linda mentioned here the issue that even in these infrastructure projects, which we see them in African countries, most of them are contracted to Chinese companies. That's why earlier I said China is really combining its aid, investment, and trade policy, like putting it together. So you get a road, you get a bridge, you get a dam, but then it's the Chinese company which is building,
Chinese workers.
So in the end, it's like also investing in its own companies, in its own people. So it's like two ways, and this is why in my statement I say if if African countries do not have good policies towards China, then this would not be beneficial to the African countries, because even in this infrastructure projects they build, there are issues of quality, for example.
Yes.
Which is very
How
critical.
long are those trains going to be running for in Kenya?
Exactly. This is very critical sometimes. So for politicians, it's good. They can use this as a political capital that we built. You see here, there is a road, there is a bridge. But again comes these questions about the quality of the.
I'd like to come in there on the quality, because our politicians have used this avenue to consolidate their power in government, and we should, if we look closely, I'm afraid that we've become a dumping ground for China, with the cheap goods and all that. And there's also a record where they said. They constructed a hospital and a bridge, and both collapsed. These will become a dumping ground for China, and this is because our leaders are not doing it for the benefit of the masses, but for their own benefits. If we get to the point where we can all agree and give China's standards, that this is the standards that Africa has for, for the bridges, for the construction of hospitals or schools, and for the products that are coming. We need to come to a place where we give them our terms and let them stick by it.
But can we? Is it viable for us to do? Because we're saying we're on the back foot. We're turning to China because, well, the West is giving us problems. Do we really have, in as much as, and I think we understand the story, we've got the resources, but we often don't have the processes to refine those resources. So we rely on external partners because our governments have not made the necessary investments. So in as much as Africa is a blessed continent with all the resources, with the people, we still need external partners. Do we have the ground to stand on to say to the Chinese, well, these are our conditions if you want to trade with us?
I would say,
let's get going.
Okay.
I think we do through our government, like what Harrison said and also Linda, if we don't have good policies, it is the politicians, and policymakers that will need to sit down and decide these standards and say, okay, if we are coming in, this is what we expect. Of course we have, because we have all the resources, so we also have a kind of, way to hold them responsible on what we want them to do in our own continent, so it should not just be a free-for-all that anyone can just come in and take everything out and give us inferior infrastructure or goods. And again, on the issue of quality, I want to comment on that. Everyone is buying from China, so I don't know why that should be a problem for African continent. It's just that our government need to sit down and set these standards. If you look like companies like Siemens in Nigeria, in Germany, most of them have production facilities in China. Mercedes-Benz, they go to China, produce their cars, then they send back to Europe and America for sale. So quality in China has really improved over the years. So it's just that the government and the companies involved, need to sit down and send monitors, people to monitor all these projects and programs.
And so these would be some of the policies that you would be recommending in terms of how we then deal with China and the money that is coming through. Are we seeing enough of that? Are we seeing any of that at all, where there is quality assurance, where our politicians come to the table and say, we accept that you want to work with us, but these are the standards? Or are we just seeing a scenario where people are just signing deals and things are being built and we don't even know how these things are going to, the longevity of these things?
Yeah, that is where the government comes in. Again, the government. Why? Because most of our leaders are interested in cutting taps. There's a project, there's a big dam, they go there, pump, then everybody will see. Yeah, of course, and for example, in a country like Nigeria, next year is election, so you see lots of these projects, whether they are relevant or not. They get this money, they get these loans, accumulating debt for the country, just to cut those steps. So if the government don't sit down and say that, okay, these are not our priorities for this, for the moment, so it's not going to work. But if we sit down and negotiate our terms with China or any other country, of course, things are going to improve, just like with other countries. Look at the phones that we are using, iPhone. Majority of the parts are manufactured in US, and it's one of the best phones in the market, because Apple took it as a responsibility to go there and monitor the production of these parts, and the assembling of these iPhone, for example.
So what I'm getting is that the sentiment that's coming from the Western world, warning African leaders about its dealings with China, we're not refuting that, but we're saying, well, who are you to be calling out the Chinese when, quite frankly, you've been doing the same. I'm also hearing that our politicians need to do better, that they need to go out there and fight for the rest of the continent, not necessarily from a position of what will it do for my party and I, but how will that translate to benefiting the man on the ground? What can ordinary citizens do to push our politicians to go into that direction? What avenues do we have as the citizens of Africa to get to our politicians and say, actually, this is what we want?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Yeah, it's not only the government of the African countries, but also the citizens, the NGOs, activists, in African countries should really criticize, or at least should really protect
because we're going to
their
pay
countries.
the debt anyway.
Yeah.
We're going to pay the debt anyway.
They should really protect their countries from being sold to China, yeah, because of this political interest. Some of the leaders have, like you said, they're interested in cutting the tape, opening up big projects, yeah. But another thing here again, there is a tendency where China actually is giving a loan to African countries, but then these loans can be paid not only in terms of cash, but they can also be paid in terms of resources, for example. So like now, Angola is paying back to China using oil. So there are some of these examples actually. So the Chinese banks, there is one bank called Export and Import Bank, and the Chinese government advises actually all these banks to just, give all these concessional loans, but they have to, there are different ways. So of course one can say, if the resources exist in African countries, why not, to pay these loans in terms of resources? But these resources are there. I mean, at some point they will finish up. Yeah. So if the citizens do not say anything about this, and the activists do not say anything about this, then in the end we'll come to a situation where our countries, African countries, all belong to China. All the resources, everything belong to China. So of course there is a responsibility also for the citizens, activists, NGOs too.
You talked about no free lunch. That is being a message to the Chinese, and we're saying policy needs to change concretely. If you're sitting at a table and you're dealing with a delegation from China and they're saying they want to invest in Nigeria, what are you saying back from where you're sitting?
It's a pity that colonization, and even like decades after decolonization, we still have this mindset that we are inferior to the West and to all these other powers. But we also should remind ourselves that this continent is the richest continent in the world. Like, we have 54% of the world's gold, we have titanium, we have cobalt, we have what the world needs. So if we didn't have those, they wouldn't be on the continent in the first place. So that's why you have the UK, the US, the China, they're all struggling to get part of Africa. And this is what we should, use to leverage. This is what we should use to bring our own terms to the table. So if we are at the table with these people, we should tell them, if you need this and that, you have to stick to these standards. And it's a pity that our governments have, we've gotten to this place where China is already buying out lands. And this is a very, it's a tricky situation, because if it continues this way, that means most of the, the oil reserve, the oil fields, the mines and all that will be owned by China. And this is where we are at the moment. These lands may not be taken back, but we need to set out our standards. Africa should have agency. They have something that the world needs, and they should tell the world, they should tell them how they want things to be run when they come in.
Do you feel that this has to be done by a country individually as it deals with China, or do African member states need to come together and say, we're taking a common approach when it comes to dealing with this power that is China? Because if you want to pit China up with, say, a country like Zimbabwe, okay, the economy sizes are virtually incomparable. Does it help our case for us to have a common policy as Africans in dealing with China?
Yeah, I think that would be a better solution to this problem. If we are able to mobilize African countries to present a common policy about dealing with China, But again, to come to this point, it's always not easy, because you will have to consider the interests of so many groups, in Africa, so many countries, so many views, so many opinions. But of course, this should be a better way to go about the problem of dealing with China. And again, to add to that, what we as young Africans can do to kind of maybe also encourage government to sit down with China to negotiate the terms of trade with Africa would be if we stop to press government for unnecessary projects. Because you see a situation whereby government will go and commission projects that are not necessary and people are happy about it without even thinking about the consequences of it. Because 2 years ago I had the opportunity to interview a policymaker in Nigeria about the energy sector, the electricity sector. At the time Nigeria was building power plant at the rate of maybe like 3 every year. And when this power plant is done, they realize that they don't have the transmission line, to transport this power to where it is needed. Then they start thinking, okay, where is the transmission line? They now start thinking about transmission line after the power plant has been built. And of course, the cost of it now rises because, the owners of the land now have something to hold the government to. So we have to start from the scratch to plan projects and not just do it just because we want to commission projects, for example. So in this way, the young people can really come in, the citizen can really come in, and also participate in helping the government to negotiate better with Chinese or other companies.
Zimbabwe has an election coming up, Nigeria, you've got yours next year, and I think that's something that we as young people can press politicians on, to say, what is your policy and how do you plan on dealing with China going forward? And these are some of the issues we should be interested in, because we are the ones who are going to be having to pay these debts that our governments and politicians are undertaking. I want to bring our discussion to an end. I'll ask you all to present your closing statements before we do so. Harrison, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, for me, each individual country to deal with China, it's tough, it's hard. Yeah. So for me, I think I would emphasize to bring back the role of regional organizations again here. Last time we discussed about the Continental Free Trade Area. So African countries are planning to have free trade area in the region, and there are also sub-regional organizations like East African Community, already having achieved common market and customs union. So these neighboring countries actually, I think, should really come up with a policy towards China, because when we talk about single market, then these countries are already connected, having one market. And if you want infrastructure project or support from China, then it had to be linked in the general interest of the region. So if it's infrastructure, then it has to connect all these countries in the region, so that in the end, the Chinese can put an infrastructure, but then this infrastructure would facilitate the process of regional integration, the businesses, to prosper in the region, people moving from one country to another and all this. So I think the African countries should really use the regional organizations they have, in coming up with some sort of common policy rather than engaging with China as individual countries.
Okay. Linda?
I'd like to go back on the point of each African state dealing with China. That will never happen, and it makes me, you guys shouldn't bounce on me yet, but it makes me feel like maybe what Nkrumah said was right, seek first the political kingdom and every other thing shall be added unto you. Maybe when we join together and become a unit, that's when we'll have an upper hand with Western powers and China. On the fact of China, someone said that, China, the US, the UK, they're all bullies, and Africa is just choosing their bullies right. But we also need to remember that, this time, the international community are at the dinner table. And like Professor Lumumba said, this time is Africa on the plate, and China, US, and the UK, they all want a piece of us. So we really need to make use of our agency and ensure that we we tell these people what we want, because they want a market, they want our natural resources, they're all garnering for it. So we need to set our standards straight. And I'd like to close with this African adage which says that whoever doesn't learn from their past would always make the same mistakes of the past. And we should really think about this and take it seriously.
And let's hope we're not too far gone in the point that we've reached a point of no return in terms of our dealings with Ubong.
Yeah, I mean, I would also like to conclude that in terms of projects, it is if our government and policy makers negotiate well with China, we could have a situation whereby for most of those projects that are not only these projects and programs are not given to Chinese companies, but are open for international competition. If we have a good negotiating position. 1, 2, that maybe they should also try to negotiate trade based on grant basis, so that the interest on the loan and not based on loan alone, because this is also one of some of the tactics that Western countries are using. They give part as loan, whereby you pay high interest on it, of course, and part of the money that they invest in developing country is as grant, whereby you just pay the principal, and not interest. So I think with this way, maybe trade relationship with China could be improved.
Oh, we certainly will watch that space, and we want to thank you for taking part in this discussion with us, and that's because we anticipate that you will comment. We want to know what you think about the trade that Africa or African countries are engaged with China. Tell us where you're from. Tell us about the projects that you've seen coming up in your country, courtesy of Chinese money. How do you feel about that going forward? We're specifically interested if you are taking this up and if you're taking this to your politicians. So please comment. We would love to engage with you. And that does it for today. And once more, we would like to thank Harrison Wilima from Tanzania. My name is Christine Mundwa from Zimbabwe. Linda Irolo is from Nigeria. And Bong Simon is also from Nigeria. Thank you for watching and goodbye.